Good morning, Wealthy Nation. I'm Adrian. Today we're talking about hegemony. It is the Hegemony Explained series. We're going to take a look at what this word means. We'll talk about hegemony in an organizational context in other videos and sort of in a company and how you define vision and direction among employees. There's hegemony in that sense. In this video we're talking about hegemony in politics, where it becomes a little bit more sinister. So let's dive right in. What better place to start? Well, I suppose we should always start with the definition. So, hegemony is simply convincing somebody that your best interests are also in their best interests. Subtly convincing somebody so that they think they've come to this conclusion on their own. They think it's their idea, that it is genuinely their best interests, when really it's serving your best interest. That's hegemony. Excuse me. Yeah, peppery topic. So let's get into it. A great example of hegemony is the war on drugs. There's this now famous quote from John Ehrlichman, who was the Nixon cabinet member in charge of domestic affairs. And John said, years and years after he was convicted in the Watergate scandal and so on, living his life peacefully down south, he was interviewed and he said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So this is now a famous quote where it's become clear that there was a willful manipulation of the public for this administration to accomplish their means to an end. So the war on drugs started with Nixon, carried on faithfully by Reagan, got much worse under Reagan, and carried on through the 90s and 2000s, and it's tapering off now, but even still not fully. We'll take a look in future videos about the current state of the war on drugs, but for the purpose, we're looking at the war on drugs in the context of hegemony. What does it mean for you when the President of the United States, night after night, gets up on the news, gets on television, and looks you in the eye and says drugs are the biggest threat to our nation? He holds up a bag of cocaine, supposedly confiscated from one of the dealers that they were supplying it to. Sorry, talk about the CIA and all of that another time. There's so much here, but in any case. So what does it mean when a president has these fireside chats? His wife, her campaign is just saying no. All of this messaging that drugs are bad, criminalize marijuana as a Schedule I drug, even though it has no known harmful side effects. Nobody has ever died from an overdose on marijuana, yet Schedule I drugs are up there as the worst category federally. It's still classified as such, and that's why we haven't really seen any progress, even though we've maybe gone more liberal, more on the left. We haven't seen any real progress, only performative progress. So the war on drugs started with Nixon, carried on through Reagan, and you can see how this hegemony is effective. This is a trusted leader. This is President Nixon, President Reagan, telling you that drugs are the biggest threat to our country, that we need to do something about it, that people who do drugs are criminals and bad people and they're coming to get you. Eliminate any room for nuance and discussion about how some drugs are not that bad and how other people are forced into these living conditions where addiction becomes really the only means for survival. So all of that, it's clear that they knew what they were doing. We created this mental association in the public and repeated it over and over and over and over so that we could create this illusion for this is how reality is. Black people and hippies are criminals. That's what the message was. They said it over and over and over and over and over, and eventually became true in the sense that it's what the public accepted as true. So that's hegemony. Moving back to our to our politicians here, back to some quotes. The war on drugs has a lot of parallels with the war on terror. So we'll take a look at that. This quote from John Ehrlichman is now famous, but we'll look at this speech from President George Bush right before we decided to invade Iraq in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks that had nothing to do with Iraq. George Bush said, "My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. For more than a decade, the United States and other nations have pursued patient and honorable efforts to disarm the Iraqi regime without war. Our good faith has not been returned." So you see how that rhetoric paints this mental association. We've been honorable and diplomatic, but our good faith has not been returned. We have to take it on their word that everything we've done has been honorable and diplomatic, even though if you look at actual history, we have a heavy-handed diplomacy that's not particularly honorable. So back to the quote. The Iraqi regime used diplomacy as a ploy to gain time and advantage. It has uniformly defied Security Council resolutions demanding full disarmament. Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. No doubt. Our government has no doubt that they possess these weapons of mass destruction. So we got to get in there and stop that threat before it gets us. We got to go beat the threat. That's what this speech is about. We didn't want to do it. We try to be diplomatic, but once we do it, we're going to come in hard. And we don't go through the whole speech where he talks about, pretty much teases shock and awe. But in any case, right there you see, again, he's creating this mental association. People who live in Iraq, bad guys, weapons of mass destruction. No room for nuance or conversation about all these different ethnic groups and religious minorities that are being persecuted and so on, and how the entire country of Iraq is itself pretty farcical because it's something that we Western colonists just carved up ourselves. So, little room for that amount of detail, because hegemony, we're saying freedom, democracy, our values, diplomacy, that's us. And that, they are not that. It's essentially that we're creating a good guy, bad guy situation in this war on terror hegemony. So we'll go back to that. When the United States government in 2003 had no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. Let's fast forward to 2005, just 2 years from the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. This was an investigation about the quality of the intelligence that was given to the government. And I'll read that middle paragraph. We conclude that the intelligence community was dead wrong in almost all of its pre-war judgments about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. This was a major intelligence failure. And I'm just going to read those first two sentences, actually, but you can see that it took us 2 years to realize we were dead wrong in almost all of our pre-war judgments about their weapons of mass destruction. But in our speech, just 2 years earlier, we had no doubt. Our intelligence gathered leaves no doubt. We are certain. And when we're certain, we got to act. So the fact is, we should have had a little bit of doubt. And you know, it is this is all hindsight, which makes it easier to criticize. But an important piece I want to emphasize is the third paragraph, and particularly the end here. I'll read the whole paragraph through. After a thorough review, the Commission found no indication that the intelligence community distorted the evidence regarding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. What the intelligence professionals told you about Saddam Hussein's programs was what they believed. They were simply wrong. And this is a really important piece of hegemony to understand. There are people like Ehrlichman and Nixon who understand and willfully create these mental associations. They understand what they're doing. And there are other people that genuinely believe what they're doing is right. They genuinely believe that this is the correct course of action. They themselves have been sold by the structural hegemony that comes from the institutions. And by that I mean, you're the president. We just had the first ever terrorist attack on domestic soil. What are you going to do about it? And you keen viewers might be thinking, what about Pearl Harbor? Here's a fun fact. Hawaii wasn't even a U.S. state when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Go look that up. But in any case, back to Bush and the war on terror. People can genuinely believe that what they're spitting out there is the fact, is the best thing for you, which is what makes hegemony so difficult. Is often they're not uneducated and not being manipulative. They are just wrong. They're just simply wrong, which is why it helps to approach these conversations with empathy and respect and a whole lot of love, because it's difficult to listen to somebody be wrong. When you think a different way and you happen to be right in that case, there are a few things where there is that objective right-wrong, but a stockpile of weapons of mass destruction is one of those things. Pretty clear. It's there or it's not, right? So faulting people doesn't do us any good. It doesn't, because it actually makes people recede harder into their original position. So approaching these conversations with empathy is what's missing right now in our conversation. Even when we tell people we're wrong, they're wrong, we're coming at it from a place where we have to believe we're unequivocally right. And then that is just an endless back and forth that we're never going to move past. So to wrap things up here, to tie a thread between the war on drugs, war on terror, really it's quite clear. We created a caricature of a terrorist, we vilified them night after night on the evening news, and we forced people from Iraq to denounce their home. If you were from the Middle East, there was no time for explanation. If you lived here, you were either for the United States or you were against us. You were either with us or against us. If you even tried to launch into an explanation about the complexity of where you came from, that is suspicious to a U.S. American. We did not like that for about 10 years, probably still through this day, I imagine. So we did this, though. We created this caricature of a terrorist, and that was hegemony, all the same as hegemony in the war on drugs. So it's really important, and just here, if you're curious where I've learned all of this, I'll leave my sources up here. Go check all of this out yourself. It's important that we understand this is a tactic politicians understand themselves and will use against us. One of my favorite quotes that summarizes this so succinctly, from none other than Kendrick Lamar. You overnight the big rifles and tell Fox to be scared of us, gang members and terrorists, etc., etc. It's a very real thing. A very real thing. So, hegemony. That's our topic for today, the week, the month, the year. It's never going away. So, we have to understand it, understand when it might be used against us, understand also how we can use it to build a movement in response to the neoliberal hegemony. We can create, hegemony is also very important for creating cohesion among organizations. So any sort of movement needs to have that collaborative, shared sense of meaning. And that's a good type of hegemony. Organizational hegemony is something that can be good. But this political hegemony, this willful villainization of ethnic groups, is a huge problem. So if ever people say, oh, we solve racism, racism doesn't exist, just look at how different races are being depicted on the news, movies and TV shows. Who's the bad guy in most movies? Usually somebody from the grainy Middle East, where they put a yellow tint over the shots there too, or it's a Russian. In the case of G.I. Joe, the main bad guy literally has a blank face. Whoever we need to impart on them at the time that's convenient for us, that's what we'll do. G.I. Joe, they started off like way before my time, but from what I've seen, started off a little bit Germanic, turned heavily Japanese and sort of Southeast Asian, because that's what the bulk of the wars were during that time. So in any case, that is right there in our face. A blank face bad guy that changes accents every couple of years? Ridiculous. But in any case, I'm starting to ramble, so we're going to wrap this up. This has been Hegemony Explained. I'm Adrian. See you next time.